The man set the box on our workbench, counted out $300 beside it, and told us the job was to make sure it never came open. In 3 years at the shop, everyone who brought us a locked desk or chest wanted in, and nobody, before that morning, had wanted the opposite. Walt folded back the moving blanket, and I looked for the lid, and I kept looking. The box was the size of a case of canning jars, dark as steeped tea, with no lid, no hinges, no keyhole, and no seam on any face. The grain ran unbroken around every corner, as if the thing had not been built, but grown, whole, inside some tree nobody ever met. Except at one low corner, where a hairline gap had started, fine as a pencil stroke and about 2 inches long. The man tapped the air above it and said it was wider than it had been at Christmas. Our shop holds the ground floor of an old harness factory in western New Hampshire, and we mend furniture mostly worth less than the mending. Walt is past 70, quiet and exact, a man who reads a board the way others read a face, and he kept his hands off this one. He asked where it came from, what wood, whose hands, and the man answered like someone reciting a lease he had not written. His name was Prather, and the box had been in his family's keeping 9 years, going on 10, in a shed with a padlock and a concrete floor. Keeping, he said, not owning. 4 families held it in turns, 10 years to a turn, and the turns had been running since before his grandfather could remember. The rules were written nowhere and known to everyone. It stays in an outbuilding off the bare ground, and it never spends a night under a roof where women or children sleep. Walt asked what happened when the rules slipped. Prather said his great aunt's people once kept it in a mudroom while the shed roof was redone, and the women of that house spent that winter in and out of the county hospital. No doctor ever put a name to it, and in January the box went back to the shed. Walt looked at the money a while, then said he wanted it gone by the end of the week, and Prather said that suited him. We set it on the heavy bench in the back room, on riser blocks, and Walt hung a blanket over the window without explaining. A split follows the grain where dry wood is weakest. This gap ran square across it, calm as a knife cut, and both edges were smooth, nothing torn. Wormy chestnut, a wood you mostly meet in barn beams now, since the trees themselves are 100 years gone. Walt measured the gap with a feeler gauge and penciled the number on the wall, and the next morning he wrote a bigger number under it. Nobody had been in the shop between the two. On the 3rd morning, the day's shavings lay in one thin straight line across the backroom floor, and the line ended below the box. Walt swept it up himself, and that afternoon he told our Saturday sweeping boy not to come for a while. The plan for the corner was old and honest. Hot hide glue worked deep, a hardwood spline, clamps, and patience. The glue went in warm and came back out. We watched a bead of it rise from the seam and stand there, as if the box were pushing, and Walt wiped it away 3 times before he stopped. He clamped the corner anyway, 4-bar clamps drawn snug, and from the middle of that seamless wood came a sound like a nail being drawn slowly out of a joist. That week I learned the difference between a building settling at night and a thing keeping time. It came as a knock, soft as a knuckle on the far side of a door, in runs of 5, only from the back room, only after dark. I stood in the doorway one night and counted along, and the knocking stopped mid-run, the way a sound stops when something hears you. Then, level with that low corner, something dragged itself one slow inch, along the inside of the wood. Our mail carrier, D, 20 years on the same route, stopped on the dorsal that Thursday and would not come in. She said the shop smelled like a root cellar gone wrong, said her head had started aching at the curb, and handed me the mail at arm's length. There was no smell, not for me and not for Walt, and after she left, we stood a while on the line between shop and daylight. That evening Walt called Prather with the door shut, and I heard the tone but not the words, even, patient, and then not. What he learned came to me the next day, in pieces, which is how Walt tells anything. The box came out of Harrow Valley, a company town 2 ridges north, off every road map since the 30s. A veneer mill, 40 company houses, a store that took scrip, and when the mill folded, the valley went from poor to something the histories do not name. The last winters up there were the kind where the county sent a nurse in March to count the living. What certain families did in those winters to turn their luck, Prather would not say on a telephone, and I have made myself stop guessing. What he did say was that the boxes were built to carry a grievance and be given away, never kept by the hands that made them. Boxes, I said, the way Walt must have said it into the phone, because until then we had assumed there was only the one. Prather came by the next evening, turning his hat in his hands, and he was honest with us, I will give him that. The turns had run 4 families wide for a century, and now they ran 3. The 4th line had ended that spring, one old man in a memory ward and nobody after. The gap at the corner had shown itself the same week that old man died. Nobody had told the box, Prather said, and then he heard what he had said, and he put his hat back on and looked at the floor. Walt is not a superstitious man, he is a careful one, which is better. He said a seam that opens from the inside is not a repair problem, it is a pressure problem, and gluing the lid on a boiling pot is no kind of craft. The box was built in that valley of its trees by its hands, and if the keeping had broken down, the keeping should go home. Prather said there was a place his grandfather had named exactly once, a stone building at the mill where the boxes had waited, in the beginning, to be given. Walt said we would drive up Saturday, and Prather would walk in with us. The Friday night before, I stayed late oiling the truck racks, and the knocking in the back room changed. The runs of 5 became runs too quick to count, less like a knuckle now and more like weight shifting from foot to foot. Under it came a new sound, thin and continuous, like a wet finger riding the rim of a glass, and it was coming from the gap. I put the light on because not seeing was worse. The clamps sat as we had left them, but the feeler gauge lay on the floor, and the gap had crept past the mark Walt made at noon. While I stood there it widened, the thickness of a playing card, with a sound like a breath let out through teeth, and the bulb over the bench browned and came back. I did not run. I backed out the way you back away from a strange dog and sat in the truck until Walt came at first light, and he did not laugh at me. We went up in the cold early, the box crated and strapped in the truck bed, touching nothing that touched us. The road in is town road for 2 miles, log road for 1, and past the iron gate it is a memory with trees in it. We carried the crate the last mile slung on 2 poles, like furniture for a house that no longer stood. The valley opens flat where the mill was, and you can read the town in its cellar holes, 40 dooryards of lilac still blooming for nobody. The powder house stood on a knob above the flood line, stone walls, slate roof, no windows, and an iron door gone over entirely to rust. Prather stopped 40 feet short and stood in the weeds with his hands at his sides, like a man at a graveside. The door was not locked. Inside was the still cold that stone keeps all summer, and Walt raised the flashlight. Shelves ran down both long walls, waist high, and on the shelves sat boxes. I counted 11 without meaning to, every one seamless, every one dark as steeped tea, and no two the same size. Some wore old mendings, splines and resin and iron straps with fresh paint on them. Someone had been keeping the seams. On the shelf ends, in chalk gone almost to ghost, ran family names and spans of years, some crossed through, and near the floor, newer chalk in a hand I did not know. On the south shelf was an open place, a square of clean board in the dust, the footprint of our box. We set it in that square, and when the wood touched the shelf, a knocking I had been half hearing, the whole walk went out like a match. A box of chalk sat on the sill by the door, half used, and I have thought about that small thing more than almost anything else. Walt read the columns a long time, and then he took up a stick of that chalk and printed 2 words at the foot of the emptiest column. He printed the name of our shop. At the gate, Prather shook our hands like a man let out of something and drove home to his family, and I am glad for him. We drive up twice a year now, wax and resin and clean rags, and tend the seams of 12 boxes, ours first. The gap has not moved since it touched that shelf, and no knock has ever come while we were in the room. On the first drive home, I asked Walt how long a turn lasts, and he watched the road for a mile before he answered. 10 years, he said, same as anybody, and he did not say the rest, which is that he is 74 and I am 26, and the chalk on that sill did not look close to running out.